444 million years ago, the oceans of our planet experienced death on an unimaginable scale. Not complete extinction, of course. Life possesses a remarkable tenacity, an extraordinary ability to cling to existence even when circumstances become nearly intolerable. Organisms find refuge in forgotten corners of the world, in marginal environments where conditions remain barely adequate for survival. Yet, if you could have somehow stood upon the ancient shorelines of that primordial earth, watching as the waves rolled endlessly across the broad continental shelves, you would have immediately sensed that something was profoundly, deeply wrong with the world spread before you. The water lapping gently at your feet would have possessed a clarity unlike anything you have ever witnessed in modern oceans. That extraordinary, unsettling transparency would have communicated everything you needed to understand about the catastrophe that had just occurred. Clear water, you see, means fundamentally empty water. It signifies the complete absence of the countless microscopic organisms that typically cloud the seas with their bodies, their metabolic waste products, their endless cycles of consuming and being consumed in the great dance of life. The clarity meant that the intricate food web, painstakingly built up over hundreds of millions of years of gradual evolution, had utterly and completely collapsed. This was the immediate aftermath of what scientists call the Ordovician Silurian extinction event, now recognized as the second most catastrophic disaster in the entire documented history of complex life on our planet. An astonishing 85% of all marine species had been completely erased from existence in what amounted to merely a geological instant when measured against the vast, almost incomprehensible expanses of deep time. The extinction unfolded in two distinct pulses of death, separated by perhaps 1 million years or so, which represents essentially nothing when we consider the immense timescales across which planetary history operates and evolves. The first devastating pulse arrived accompanied by ice, relentless and unforgiving. Massive continental glaciers spread inexorably across the southern supercontinent that geologists call Gondwana, locking up such enormous quantities of water that global sea levels plummeted dramatically and suddenly. The shallow marine environments where the overwhelming majority of life had evolved to thrive simply vanished, disappearing as if they had never existed at all. Countless creatures that had evolved successful adaptations over hundreds of millions of years suddenly found themselves stranded in a world that literally no longer had room for their existence. They perished in numbers that are genuinely difficult for the human mind to truly comprehend. Then came the second pulse of extinction, and this one arrived, paradoxically, with warmth instead of cold. As the massive glaciers finally retreated and the seas began to rise once again, you might reasonably expect that life would have breathed a collective sigh of relief, that surviving organisms would have gratefully expanded back into newly available habitats. Instead, the warming triggered something far more sinister than the cold had ever been. The oceans became thermally stratified, with warm surface waters effectively trapping cold oxygen-depleted water in the depths below, creating a layered structure that prevented mixing and circulation. Vast regions of the ancient seafloor turned completely anoxic, utterly devoid of the oxygen that complex life absolutely requires to survive. In some particularly devastated areas, the ocean chemistry shifted toward euxenia, a nightmarish condition where hydrogen sulfide, the same noxious compound that gives rotten eggs their characteristic unpleasant smell, accumulated in toxic concentrations that poisoned everything they touched. The seas themselves, the ancient cradle of all life on Earth, had quite literally turned poisonous to the very organisms that depended upon them for survival. The victims of this two-stage catastrophe read like a comprehensive census of Ordovician marine life. Trilobites, those distinctive armored arthropods that had dominated the ocean floors for well over 100 million years, lost entire taxonomic families in the space of just a few thousand generations. Brachiopods, the abundant shellfish that had carpeted the continental shelves in densities we can barely imagine today, saw their spectacular diversity collapse to a mere fraction of its former glory. Bryozoans, graptolites, corals, crinoids, every major group of marine organisms felt the terrible scythe of extinction pass through their ranks, leaving behind only scattered, traumatized survivors. The elaborate reef communities that had been steadily building complexity since the Cambrian explosion were utterly devastated, their intricate three-dimensional structures crumbling as the specialized organisms that built and maintained them perished en masse. The ocean ecosystems that had taken hundreds of millions of years to painstakingly construct were dismantled and destroyed in what amounted to an evolutionary eye blink. And yet, remarkably and somewhat unexpectedly, when the killing finally stopped and the chemistry of the oceans gradually began to stabilize once more, the survivors did something genuinely unexpected. They did not merely cling to existence in diminished numbers, huddling in marginal environments while waiting passively for better days to arrive. Instead, they began almost immediately to expand aggressively into the empty ecological niches left behind by the extinct species. These vacant niches were like abandoned apartments in a city after a devastating plague has swept through, and the remaining tenants wasted absolutely no time whatsoever in moving into the available spaces. Brachiopod genera that had previously been confined to the geographical margins of the ancient continent of Laurentia spread across the entire globe within just a few million years. Coral species that had barely survived the extinction began to diversify with remarkable speed, their descendants laying the foundations for reef systems that would eventually rival anything the Ordovician period had produced. The recovery was not merely a simple restoration of what had been lost, but rather a fundamental transformation of how marine ecosystems were organized and functioned. This remarkable period of recovery, innovation, and ecological transformation would come to be called the Silurian, a name derived from the Silures, an ancient Celtic tribe that once inhabited the borderlands of Wales, where rocks of this particular age were first systematically studied by pioneering geologists in the 19th century. The Silurian period would last approximately 24 million years, a remarkably brief span by geological standards, barely a single chapter in the immensely long book of Earth's 4-billion-year history. But what an extraordinarily consequential chapter it would prove to be for the future of life on our planet. In the recovering seas, fish would develop hinged jaws for the very first time in the history of vertebrate life, a transformation that might seem almost mundane or trivial, until you pause to realize that every single vertebrate mouth that has existed since then, including the one you use to speak and eat every single day, has inherited that revolutionary innovation. The jawed mouth is your direct inheritance from the Silurian seas. Giant arthropods called Eurypterids would grow to lengths exceeding 2.5 meters, becoming the largest arthropods that have ever lived in Earth's entire history. These formidable creatures served as apex predators in a marine world still struggling to recover from the catastrophe that had recently devastated it. Their reign would be brief in geological terms, but their impact on marine ecosystems would be profound and lasting. And on the barren land, something even more revolutionary was beginning to stir, something that would ultimately transform the entire appearance of our planet beyond recognition. For approximately 4 billion years, nearly the entire history of Earth as a planet, the continents had been essentially lifeless expanses of barren rock, sand, and profound silence under a sky that offered virtually no protection whatsoever from the sun's harmful ultraviolet radiation. Complex life had been confined entirely to the protective waters of the oceans and seas, but the Silurian atmosphere was changing in fundamental ways that would alter everything. Oxygen levels were gradually rising, and with them came the formation of the ozone layer that would finally, for the first time in planetary history, make terrestrial life genuinely possible. Tiny plants, growing no taller than your finger, began tentatively to colonize the edges of streams and estuaries. Their primitive vascular tissues represented an elegant engineering solution to the challenges of terrestrial life, a solution that would eventually result in covering the Earth in verdant green vegetation. Following closely behind these pioneering plants came the arthropods, millipedes and centipedes, and the ancient ancestors of spiders. These were the very first animals capable of breathing air directly and walking upon dry land without any need whatsoever to return to water for respiration or reproduction. They were the advance guard of a transformation that would reshape the continents forever. The warming seas of the early Silurian period stretched extensively across continental shelves that were far broader and considerably shallower than anything we observe in the modern world. Sea levels, swollen dramatically by the melting of massive Ordovician glaciers, had risen to extraordinary heights, flooding the low-lying interiors of continents and creating vast epicontinental seas that penetrated hundreds upon hundreds of kilometers inland. These inland seas created entirely new marine environments on a scale difficult to imagine today. In these warm, exceptionally well-lit waters, conditions proved absolutely perfect for life to flourish once more after the devastation of the extinction. Abundant sunlight penetrated all the way to the bottom in many areas, efficiently fueling the photosynthesis that forms the foundation of all marine food webs. Nutrients cycled continuously through the water column, supporting the gradual rebuilding of ecosystem structure from the bottom up. And into this welcoming aquatic environment, the survivors began to spread and multiply with remarkable speed. Generation after generation, species after species, gradually filling the emptiness with movement, color, and the endless business of living. The recovery of marine life began tentatively in the shallows, particularly along the margins of Laurentia, in warm waters that gently lapped against what would eventually become the eastern edge of North America. Life was stirring again with surprising vigor within just a few 100,000 years of the extinction's end, and this seems almost impossibly fast to us, accustomed as we are to thinking of evolution as a process that unfolds over timescales far beyond any human comprehension. But the survivors of the extinction were working with something they had never had access to before: empty space. The ecological niches were vacant, swept clean by catastrophe. The competitors that had occupied those niches for millions of years were dead and gone. The predators that had kept populations carefully in check for countless generations had vanished entirely. The organisms that remained suddenly found themselves living in a world where the only real limit to exponential expansion was simply how fast they could reproduce and spread. In the region of Laurentia, biological diversity bounced back to pre-extinction levels within roughly 5 million years, a recovery that seems remarkably rapid when you truly contemplate it. 5 million years is admittedly a very long time by human standards, certainly enough time to take us from the present day all the way back to when our distant ancestors were just beginning to experiment with walking upright on the African savanna. But in the slow, patient calendar of geological time, 5 million years barely registers as significant. It is hardly enough time for substantial thicknesses of sediment to accumulate into recognizable distinct rock layers. Globally, the recovery process took considerably longer than it did in Laurentia. Perhaps 15 million years passed before the world's oceans collectively reached the same comprehensive levels of biodiversity they had known before the killing started. Some regions of the globe had been hit far harder than others by the extinction, and the survivors in those particularly devastated areas had considerably further to climb in their recovery. Rebuilding genuinely complex food webs required far more than simply filling empty niches with warm bodies and rapid reproduction. The intricate relationships between different species, the subtle dependencies connecting predator to prey to scavenger to the microscopic organisms that recycle their waste products, all of these ecological connections had to be painstakingly re-established through countless generations of evolutionary trial and error. The process was gradual, uneven, and sometimes involved surprising innovations that had never existed in the pre-extinction world. Yet perhaps the most striking and consequential change was not found in the speed of the recovery itself, but rather in its fundamental character, in what the post-extinction world actually looked like compared to what had come before. The Ordovician world had been organized as a complex patchwork of distinct biological provinces, with each continent and region hosting its own unique assemblage of species that had evolved in relative isolation over tens of millions of years. A brachiopod species living on the seafloor near what is now Morocco would have looked dramatically different from its distant evolutionary cousins inhabiting the continental shelves near Laurentia. The mass extinction fundamentally changed that biogeographical pattern. When 85% of species disappear in a geological instant, the survivors that remain are decidedly not a random sample of what existed before the catastrophe. The organisms that made it through tended strongly to be generalists, species with broad environmental tolerances and flexible lifestyles that had allowed them to endure conditions that killed their more specialized neighbors. These generalist survivors spread with remarkable rapidity across the recovering world once the immediate crisis had finally passed. Their descendants colonized environments ranging from tropical seas near the equator to much cooler waters approaching the poles, creating communities that looked surprisingly similar across vast geographical distances. The highly endemic, regionally distinct faunas that had characterized the Ordovician world gave way to something far more cosmopolitan and widespread. You can observe this dramatic pattern with particular clarity in the brachiopods, those shelled creatures that superficially resemble modern clams, but actually belong to an entirely different, far more ancient branch of the animal family tree. Before the extinction event, brachiopod communities had varied dramatically and distinctively from region to region across the globe, their compositions shaped by millions of years of local adaptation to specific environmental conditions. Afterward, following the devastation, a relatively small handful of surviving lineages spread across the entire globe with truly striking speed. The Pentamerids underwent an explosive evolutionary radiation in the early Silurian period, their thick-shelled descendants appearing in remarkably similar environments on nearly every continent within just a few million years. But there was an interesting and significant twist to this story. These new Pentamerid species were consistently noticeably smaller than their Ordovician ancestors had been. This pattern, which paleontologists call the Lilliput effect, appears again and again in the fossil record in the aftermath of mass extinctions throughout Earth's history. The brachiopods were certainly rebuilding their marine dynasty in the Silurian seas, but they were absolutely not working alone in this endeavor. Across the shallow continental shelves that fringed the scattered continents, other groups of survivors were simultaneously getting to work on something even more ambitious than simply repopulating empty habitats. They were reconstructing the very physical architecture of marine ecosystems from the ground up. The Ordovician period had seen reef communities reach genuinely impressive levels of complexity and size, with corals, sponges, bryozoans, and dozens of other groups working together to construct elaborate three-dimensional habitats that sheltered and supported countless smaller organisms. The extinction had demolished these living structures with brutal efficiency, leaving behind only jumbled rubble fields where intricate thriving ecosystems had once existed. Now, in the gradually warming Silurian seas, new builders were laying foundations that would eventually surpass anything the Ordovician world had managed to produce. Stromatoporoids led the reconstruction effort, these distinctive calcareous sponges whose exact biological relationships remain somewhat mysterious. Even to modern scientists, had survived the extinction in significantly diminished numbers, but the empty continental shelves offered them unprecedented room to expand and experiment. The reefs that rose slowly from the Silurian sea floor were genuinely like nothing the world had ever witnessed before. For billions of years, nearly the entire history of life on Earth, microbial mats and stromatolites had been the only structures capable of building upward from the ocean bottom, and their distinctive layered domes rarely reached more than a meter or two in total height. The Ordovician period had seen the development of the first true animal-built reefs, modest constructions created by bryozoans and early corals that hinted tantalizingly at what might be possible when organisms work together. The master architects of this underwater construction boom were the stromatoporoids, working alongside tabulate corals. These colonial animals constructed characteristic honeycomb-like skeletons of calcium carbonate, with each individual polyp living in its own small tube and contributing to the steadily growing structure of the colony. Together, working in unconscious cooperation over millions of years, stromatoporoids and tabulate corals created something genuinely new in the history of life: wave-resistant carbonate platforms capable of withstanding the constant battering of ocean currents and violent storms. Layer built methodically upon layer, year after year, century after century, until some of these structures rose more than 100 meters above the surrounding seafloor. Underwater mountains built entirely by living organisms, some of the most spectacular biological constructions the planet had yet produced. The reefs did not exist in isolation from the surrounding marine environment. They were complex, highly integrated ecosystems, elaborate communities where hundreds of different species found food, shelter, and crucial opportunities for reproduction. Crinoids anchored themselves firmly to hard surfaces and extended their feathery arms into the current, filtering tiny particles efficiently from the water. Brachiopods clustered in sheltered spots throughout the reef structure. Bryozoans encrusted every available surface. Trilobites prowled the reef margins, scavenging dead organic matter and hunting smaller prey. What made these communities truly remarkable and unprecedented was their extraordinary ecological complexity. Modern coral reefs are justly famous for their biodiversity, their intricate webs of predator and prey, their countless specialized ecological niches filled by organisms adapted to very specific ways of life. The Silurian reefs were approaching this impressive level of complexity for the first time in Earth's entire history. You can still visit the remains of these ancient reef systems today, though they have been transformed almost beyond recognition by 400 million years of relentless geological processes. The island of Gotland, located off the coast of Sweden in the Baltic Sea, preserves some of the finest Silurian reef exposures anywhere in the world. Walking along its rocky coastline, you are literally walking on the compressed and lithified remains of reef communities that thrived when this part of Baltica lay in tropical waters near the equator. Similar reef deposits occur extensively across the American Midwest, from Wisconsin through Illinois to Indiana, where Silurian limestones form prominent ridges in the landscape and provide the raw material for countless quarries. The reefs that once lined the margins of tropical Laurentia now lie buried beneath cornfields and suburbs, their fossilized remains occasionally exposed in road cuts and construction sites. The Silurian reefs represented a genuine quantum leap in the complexity of marine ecosystems, but they were not the only revolution happening in those ancient seas. While stromatoporoids and corals were building their limestone empires, something far more dangerous was prowling the waters around them. Predators unlike anything the world had seen before, armored hunters that would grow to sizes that still astonish scientists today. They were not actually scorpions, despite the evocative name that has followed them through the scientific literature for well over a century. The Eurypterids belonged to a group called the chelicerates, the same ancient lineage that would eventually produce spiders, ticks, and horseshoe crabs. They breathed through gills, not lungs. They had no stinger, no venom, nothing that would qualify them as scorpions in any meaningful biological sense. But when 19th century naturalists first encountered their distinctive fossils, seeing the segmented bodies, the grasping appendages, the long pointed tails, they reached for the most dramatic comparison available to them: sea scorpions. The name stuck, and perhaps that is fitting, because these creatures were every bit as nightmarish as their terrestrial namesakes, and they were considerably, dramatically larger. The Silurian period was their golden age. Eurypterids had appeared earlier in the Ordovician, but as modest creatures that left only scattered traces in the fossil record. But something about the post-extinction world suited them perfectly. Perhaps it was the rebuilding reef ecosystems teeming with potential prey. Perhaps it was the absence of competitors that had kept their numbers in check before. Whatever the reason, Eurypterids diversified explosively in the Silurian. Over 250 species would eventually evolve, ranging from forms no larger than a human hand to genuine monsters that stretched longer than a grown man is tall. The giant among giants was Jacalopterus rhenaniae, an animal that holds a distinction no other arthropod has ever claimed. It was the largest of its kind to ever live in Earth's entire history. Complete specimens of Jacalopterus are frustratingly rare, but a single fossilized claw discovered in Germany allowed scientists to estimate the full size of the creature that once wielded it. That claw measured an impressive 46 centimeters long, and it was missing its terminal spine. Working backward from the known proportions of related species, researchers calculated that Jacalopterus reached lengths of approximately 2.5 meters, roughly 8 feet from the tip of its head to the end of its tail. Try to picture this animal in life, swimming through the Silurian seas. Its body was segmented like a lobster's, covered in a tough exoskeleton that would have gleamed dark and wet in the dim waters where it hunted. The head bore a pair of large compound eyes, capable of detecting movement in murky conditions. 6 pairs of appendages extended from beneath the body, the front pair modified into those enormous pincers, the middle pairs adapted for walking or swimming, and the rear pair flattened into broad paddles that propelled the creature through the water with surprising speed. What did it eat? Anything it could catch. The waters of the Silurian and early Devonian contained abundant fish, many of them armored with bony plates that might seem like adequate protection against predators. but the claws of Echolopterus were built specifically for crushing, their inner edges lined with teeth that could grip and puncture even heavily armored prey. The fossil evidence tells a grim story. Fish with distinctive gouges in their armor that match the dimensions of Eurypterid claws, coprolites containing fragments of fish bone, trackways showing the pursuit and capture of fleeing prey. These were not ambush predators waiting patiently for food to wander within reach. They were active hunters, swimming through the water column, chasing down prey, using their superior size and weaponry to dominate every environment they entered. If you had been swimming in the coastal waters of Silurian Laurentia, you would have shared the sea with these creatures. The smaller species might have scattered at your approach, darting into crevices or burying themselves in sediment. But the giants, Echolopterus, Pterygotus, Acuteramus, would not have fled from anything. To them, you would have been simply another potential meal, soft-bodied and slow, lacking the armor or speed necessary to survive an encounter. Yet even these armored giants had to share their world with other hunters, creatures that were evolving innovations far more consequential than mere size or strength. In the same waters where Eurypterids reigned supreme, a quieter revolution was underway among the fish, a transformation in the structure of their bodies that would ultimately reshape the entire vertebrate lineage. Long before the Eurypterids reached their monstrous sizes, the oceans had belonged to a different kind of creature entirely. The first vertebrates were humble animals, soft-bodied and small, lacking the jaws that would later define their descendants. They had no teeth to bite with, no powerful muscles to chase down prey, no armor to protect them from the predators that shared their world. What they did have was a notochord, a flexible rod of cartilage running the length of their bodies that provided structural support and allowed for the undulating swimming motion that fish still use today. This simple innovation would prove to be one of the most consequential developments in the history of life. Every vertebrate alive today traces its ancestry back to those ancient, jawless swimmers. By the Silurian period, the descendants of those early pioneers had diversified into a bewildering variety of forms, most of them united by a single defining characteristic: armor. The ostracoderms, as scientists collectively call these armored jawless fish, had evolved bony plates and scales that covered their heads and sometimes their entire bodies, transforming them into living tanks. The thelodonts were among the most widespread of these armored swimmers, their fossils turning up in Silurian rocks from every major continent. The osteostracans took a different approach to armor, developing massive bony head shields that covered their entire front end. The gulliaspids, evolving in isolation in ancient China and Vietnam, developed head shields even more elaborate, with bizarre shapes that included horseshoe-like crescents and lateral projections. None of these fish had jaws. This seems like such a fundamental limitation that it is worth pausing to consider how they managed to survive and thrive for tens of millions of years without the ability to bite. The answer lies in the variety of feeding strategies that jawless fish developed to exploit different food sources. Many were deposit feeders, using their circular or slit-like mouths to vacuum organic material from the seafloor. Others were filter feeders. Some may have been parasites. But this world of armored grazers and jawless filter feeders was already changing in fundamental ways. Somewhere in the Silurian seas, probably in shallow coastal environments where competition for food was particularly intense, certain fish were undergoing a transformation that would reshape the entire vertebrate lineage. The cartilaginous arches that supported their gills were bending in new directions, moving forward, articulating in ways that allowed them to open and close. The jaw may be the single most important innovation in the history of vertebrates. Consider for a moment everything that jaws make possible. They allow an animal to bite, to grasp, to tear, to chew. Actions so fundamental to our experience of being alive that we rarely pause to consider what life would be like without them. Every time you eat a meal, speak a word, or smile at someone you love, you are using structures that evolved from the gill arches of ancient fish swimming in Silurian seas. The raw material for this transformation was already present in jawless fish, waiting to be repurposed by evolution. The gills of early vertebrates were supported by a series of cartilaginous arches, curved structures that held the gill slits open and provided attachment points for the muscles that pumped water across the respiratory surfaces. At some point in the early Silurian period, the first pair of these arches began to change. Then, in 2022, a series of papers emerged from China that transformed our understanding of early vertebrate evolution. A team led by Min Zhu announced the discovery of remarkably complete fossils from early Silurian rocks in Chongqing, specimens that preserved the detailed anatomy of fish that lived approximately 439 million years ago. Among these fossils was Canodus duplicis, a small fish whose teeth represent the oldest evidence of jaws ever found. Two major groups of jawed fish emerged from this early experimentation to dominate the Silurian seas. The placoderms were the first to develop truly robust jaws, their heads and thoraxes covered in interlocking plates of bone. But unlike the ostracoderms, the placoderms could bite. Their jaws were formed from sharpened edges of bone that worked like shearing blades, capable of slicing through flesh and crushing shells. The acanthodians took a different path. These fish, sometimes misleadingly called spiny sharks, were not actually sharks at all. What made acanthodians distinctive was the array of spines that supported their fins, bony projections that jutted out from their bodies and may have served as defensive weapons against predators. The emergence of jawed fish fundamentally altered the dynamics of marine ecosystems. For the first time, vertebrates could be active predators rather than passive filter feeders or scavengers. They could compete directly with invertebrates like Eurypterids for prey, and over time they would prove to be formidable competitors. The great sea scorpions that had dominated the Silurian would decline through the Devonian, eventually disappearing entirely, while jawed fish would explode into thousands of species. The jaw revolution did more than reshape marine food webs. It set the stage for everything that would follow in vertebrate evolution. The fish that would eventually crawl onto land and become the first amphibians were jawed fish. The reptiles that would dominate the Mesozoic, the mammals that would inherit the earth after them, the birds that fill our skies today, all of them are descendants of those early jawed pioneers. But the jaw was not the only revolution underway in the Silurian world. While fish were transforming the possibilities of life in the water, something equally momentous was happening in the atmosphere above them, and that atmospheric transformation would finally open the door to life on land. For most of Earth's history, the land was a killing field. Not because of predators or harsh temperatures or lack of water, though all of these would eventually pose challenges. The land was deadly because of something far more insidious: ultraviolet radiation. High-energy UV light poured down from the sun in quantities that would have been instantly lethal to any complex organism foolish enough to venture onto the exposed surface. The problem was oxygen, or rather the lack of it. In the modern atmosphere, oxygen molecules high in the stratosphere absorb ultraviolet radiation and transform into ozone. This ozone accumulates in a diffuse layer roughly 15 to 35 kilometers above the Earth's surface, and although it would fit into a band only a few millimeters thick if compressed to sea level pressure, it absorbs the vast majority of the sun's most dangerous ultraviolet wavelengths. The ozone layer did not always exist. For the first 2 billion years of Earth's history, the atmosphere contained virtually no free oxygen. Then came the Great Oxidation Event, roughly 2.4 billion years ago. But even after oxygen appeared, Earth's ozone remained unstable for nearly 2 billion years, prevented from accumulating by iodine compounds released from the oceans. Only around 500 million years ago did the ozone layer stabilize at levels capable of providing meaningful protection from ultraviolet radiation. The Silurian atmosphere had crossed this critical threshold. Oxygen levels had risen to perhaps 10 to 15% of their modern values, enough to generate and maintain an ozone layer that blocked the most dangerous UV wavelengths. For the first time in 4 billion years of planetary history, complex organisms could survive in the open air without being destroyed by invisible light. The door to the land had finally cracked open. The organisms that would eventually take advantage of this new opportunity were already present in the Silurian seas, living in tidal zones and estuaries where they experienced regular exposure to air. Algae and cyanobacteria had long colonized the edges of the water, forming mats and films on rocks that were periodically exposed by low tides. The first forests did not exist. The first meadows did not exist. The first blades of grass, the first flowers, the first leaves broad enough to cast a shadow, none of these had yet appeared on Earth. When plants first colonized the land in the Silurian, they were barely recognizable as plants at all. They had no roots to anchor them in soil, no leaves to capture sunlight, no seeds to disperse their offspring across the landscape. What they had was something far more fundamental: vascular tissue, a system of internal tubes capable of transporting water from one part of the organism to another. This single innovation would prove to be the key that unlocked the continents. The earliest of these vascular pioneers was Cooksonia, a plant so small and simple that you might walk past a living specimen without ever noticing it. The largest known fossils stand perhaps 6 centimeters tall, roughly the height of your thumb. The entire plant consisted of a branching stem that divided into Y-shaped forks, each branch ending in a tiny bulbous structure called a sporangium, where reproductive spores were produced. Cooksonia was named in honor of Isabel Cookson, an Australian paleobotanist who spent decades studying the earliest land plants. The oldest confirmed Cooksonia fossils come from the Czech Republic and date to roughly 425 to 427 million years ago, placing them firmly in the Wenlock epoch of the Middle Silurian. Running up the center of each stem was a dark strand of tissue, visible as a thin line when the stem was cut in cross-section. This was the vascular bundle, the plant's internal plumbing system, composed of specialized cells called tracheids that had evolved the ability to transport water against the pull of gravity. Cooksonia also possessed stomata, microscopic pores on the surface of its stems that could open and close to regulate the exchange of gases with the atmosphere. When the stomata opened, carbon dioxide could enter for photosynthesis and oxygen could escape as a waste product. When they closed, the plant could conserve water. The world that Cooksonia inhabited was not entirely barren. Microbial mats and crusts had long colonized the edges of water bodies. Mosses and liverworts may have been present as well. What made Cooksonia different was its ability to grow upward, to rise above the competition for light and disperse its spores on the wind. In Australia, paleontologists have found fossils of Baragwanathia, a plant considerably more complex than Cooksonia that appears in rocks of similar or even slightly older age. Baragwanathia longifolia had true leaves, small scale-like structures that spiraled around its stems, and it could grow to heights of perhaps 25 centimeters. Whatever the precise timeline, the Silurians saw the establishment of vascular plants as permanent residents of the terrestrial environment. They remained confined to moist habitats near water, but they had crossed a threshold that would never be uncrossed. The land was turning green at its edges, and where plants led, animals would inevitably follow. The plants had been first, but they would not be alone for long. Within a few million years of the earliest vascular plants establishing themselves in coastal wetlands, something else began to move across the damp margins between sea and land. They came on many legs, 6, 8, dozens, hundreds, and they brought with them a revolution in animal physiology. The transition from water to air presented challenges that plants had not faced. An animal cannot simply sit in one place and absorb what it needs from the environment. It must move, find food, avoid predators, locate mates. All of these activities require energy, which requires oxygen, which requires a way of extracting that oxygen from whatever medium surrounds the organism. The solution that arthropods evolved was the tracheal system, a network of internal tubes that carry air directly from openings on the body surface to the tissues that need it. These openings, called spiracles, can be seen on the sides of insects and many other terrestrial arthropods today. The oldest evidence of this air-breathing apparatus comes from a creature found in Silurian rocks near Stonehaven on the northeastern coast of Scotland. Pneumodesmus pneumani was a millipede or something very close to one, and it lived approximately 430 million years ago. The fossil itself is tiny, but preserved on its surface are unmistakable spiracles, the breathing holes that mark it as an air-breathing animal. Pneumodesmus was a detridivore, an animal that fed on dead and decaying organic matter. This makes ecological sense for an early land colonizer. The first terrestrial ecosystems would have been simple affairs, lacking the complex food webs that characterize modern environments. Dead plant material, bacterial mats, fungal growths, algal crusts, these would have been the primary food sources available. But millipedes were not the only arthropods making the transition to land. The fossil record of the late Silurian, particularly from a site called Ludford Lane in Shropshire, England, reveals that terrestrial ecosystems had already achieved a surprising level of complexity by around 414 million years ago. At Ludford Lane, paleontologists have found not only detridivores, but predators. At least 2 species of centipede and a trigonotarbid arachnid, an extinct relative of spiders. The presence of predators implies the presence of prey, which implies a functioning food web with multiple trophic levels. The centipedes at Ludford Lane were hunters. Their flattened bodies and numerous legs were adapted for pursuing prey through the leaf litter and soil crevices. Unlike millipedes, centipedes have 1 pair of legs per body segment and can move with startling speed. Their front legs had been modified into venomous fangs called forcipules, capable of injecting toxins that paralyzed smaller arthropods. The trigonotarbid arachnids were equally formidable predators, related to modern spiders but belonging to an entirely separate lineage. Trigonotarbids had 8 legs and segmented abdomens covered in plates of hardened cuticle. They could not spin silk, but they were ambush predators nonetheless. Early scorpions were also present during the Silurian, though their relationship with land was more ambiguous. Many Silurian scorpions retained book gills rather than book lungs, suggesting they were still primarily aquatic. They may have been transitional forms capable of brief excursions onto land. By the end of the Silurian, the outlines of terrestrial ecosystems were becoming clear. Primary producers, the simple vascular plants and the microbial mats that preceded them, formed the base of the food web. Detridivores like millipedes processed dead organic matter. Predators like centipedes and trigonotarbids hunted the detridivores in each other. Life had established a permanent presence on land, and it would never retreat to the sea. The arthropods had proven that the continents were habitable, but they were working with a world still in transition. Yet, even as these first colonizers were establishing their beachhead, the planet itself was changing in ways that would reshape the possibilities for life on land. The continents of the Silurian world would have been utterly unrecognizable to modern eyes. If you could have somehow looked down at Earth from space 430 million years ago, you would have searched in vain for the familiar shapes. Instead, your gaze would have fallen upon a planet dominated by water. The southern hemisphere was occupied almost entirely by an enormous supercontinent called Gondwana. This gigantic landmass stretched from the South Pole northward, extending past the equator. Near the equator sat Laurentia, a substantial continent that included most of what would eventually become North America, Greenland, and a significant piece of what is now Scotland. To the east of Laurentia, across a steadily narrowing stretch of water called the Iapetus Ocean, another substantial continent was slowly approaching. Baltica comprised most of modern Scandinavia, the Baltic states, and significant portions of Eastern Europe. Throughout the Silurian period, this landmass was rotating and drifting westward toward an inevitable collision. Between Laurentia and Baltica sat Avalonia, a relatively slender microcontinent that had drifted away from Gondwana and was now moving northward. Avalonia carried the ancient rocks that would eventually become England, Wales, southeastern Ireland, and parts of eastern Newfoundland. The Iapetus Ocean was actively dying throughout the Silurian period. For hundreds of millions of years, this substantial body of water had separated Laurentia from Baltica. But the forces that drive continental drift were relentlessly pushing these landmasses together at rates of just a few centimeters per year. By the late Silurian period, the Iapetus had narrowed dramatically, and the collision that would close it entirely was already beginning in earnest. This collision would build mountains on a scale that may have rivaled the modern Himalayas. Geologists call this mountain-building episode the Caledonian Orogeny. The collision also brought together distinct pieces of land that had evolved separately for hundreds of millions of years. Scotland, riding on the leading edge of Laurentia, finally met England, which had traveled northward as part of Avalonia. The suture between them runs roughly along the line of the modern border between Scotland and England. When you hike through the Scottish Highlands today, you are walking directly on the deeply eroded roots of mountains that rose when continents collided more than 400 million years ago, monuments to a world that no longer exists. The global geography of the Silurian period had profound implications for ocean circulation patterns, climate systems, and the distribution of life. With so much land concentrated in the southern hemisphere, the northern polar region was dominated almost entirely by open ocean. This configuration allowed warm equatorial currents to flow relatively freely around the globe. The result was a world that was, on average, considerably warmer than today, with shallow seas regularly flooding the low-lying interiors of continents. At the height of the marine transgression, roughly 65% of what is now North America lay beneath the waves. By the end of the Silurian period, these shallow seas would begin their gradual retreat. Sea levels dropped significantly, exposing land that had been continuously submerged for millions of years. In the isolated basins left behind, intense evaporation concentrated the remaining seawater into increasingly briny pools that eventually precipitated thick deposits of salt and gypsum. The Silurian did not end with a bang. There was no asteroid impact, no supervolcanic eruption, no sudden catastrophe comparable to the extinction that had ushered the period in. The transition from the Silurian to the Devonian was a gradual affair, a slow shifting of conditions that unfolded over millions of years. Sea levels fell, climates shifted. The great reef systems that had flourished through the middle of the period began to change in character, Life continued, adapted, and eventually crossed a threshold that geologists would later recognize as the beginning of a new chapter. The Predoli epoch, the final stage of the Silurian, lasted roughly 3 million years. During this time, the trends that would define the Devonian were already becoming apparent. The shallow seas that had flooded continental interiors were retreating, exposing land that had been submerged since the early Silurian, or even longer. The retreat of the seas left behind something unexpected. As seawater became trapped in shrinking pools, evaporation concentrated the remaining water until it became saturated with dissolved minerals. Salt and gypsum began to precipitate out, accumulating in thick layers. The Caledonian Mountains were eroding rapidly during this time. Rivers swollen with sediment poured down their flanks, carrying sand and gravel toward the coastal plains. This sediment accumulated in thick deposits of red and brown sandstone, the old red sandstone that would give the supercontinent one of its names. The marine world was changing too. The great reef systems continued to function, but their composition was shifting. Several minor extinction events punctuated the late Silurian, brief intervals of elevated disappearance rates that pruned some lineages while leaving others untouched. The fish were diversifying through all of this, relatively unaffected by the environmental changes. Jawed fish were becoming more common, their descendants spreading into new habitats. The placoderms were on the rise. The stage was being set for the Devonian, the period that would come to be known as the Age of Fishes. On land, the colonization that had begun with Cooksonia and the first arthropods was gaining momentum. Plants were spreading inland from their original beachheads, following rivers and streams. They were still small, still simple, still confined to moist environments, but they were present and diversifying. By the end of the Silurian, the continents were no longer truly barren. They were greened at the edges, touched by life in ways that would have been impossible just 20 million years earlier. The Silurian had lasted approximately 24 million years, a relatively brief span compared to some geological periods. The world that emerged from the Ordovician extinction had been impoverished and traumatized. The world that passed into the Devonian was something entirely different, richer, more complex, fundamentally transformed. What exactly had the Silurian accomplished? Consider the jaw. Every time you eat, every time you speak, every time you smile, you are using a structure that first appeared in the Silurian seas. Consider the land. Before the Silurian, the continents had been essentially lifeless for 4 billion years. By the end, vascular plants had established themselves and arthropods had followed them. Consider the ozone layer. The atmospheric chemistry that made terrestrial colonization possible reached its critical threshold during the Silurian. Without stable ozone, there would be no land plants, no terrestrial arthropods, no amphibians, no dinosaurs, no mammals, no human beings. Consider the reefs. The stromatoporoid coral reef systems represented a quantum leap in ecosystem complexity. These reefs were not merely collections of organisms, they were integrated communities with complex food webs and symbiotic relationships. Consider the continents themselves. The collision that formed Laurussia was a critical step in the assembly of Pangaea. The Caledonian Mountains would erode into the sediments that preserved the fossils we study today. These legacies are not abstract historical facts. They are present realities woven into the fabric of the modern world. The petroleum that powers transportation originated in Silurian black shales. The limestone that builds our cities is often composed of Silurian reef organisms. The salt that preserves our food was deposited in evaporating Silurian seas. The very body you inhabit carries the inheritance of innovations that first appeared in fish swimming through waters that vanished 400 million years ago. If you were to somehow meet your Silurian ancestors, the tiny jawed fish, the minuscule arthropods, you would not recognize them as relatives. Yet, the connection is there, written in your DNA. The Silurian gave us jaws, it gave us land, it gave us the atmosphere that makes terrestrial life possible, and the reefs that anchor marine biodiversity. In 24 million years, this quiet period accomplished transformations that would echo through every subsequent chapter of the story. 444 million years ago, the oceans died. We began this journey in the aftermath of catastrophe, standing on the shores of an empty sea. If you had been there, you might have wondered whether life could ever recover from such a blow. They did not remain empty. Within a few million years, the survivors had begun to spread, filling the vacant niches with their descendants. The recovery was not merely a restoration. It was a transformation. And then came the land. For 4 billion years, the continents had been waiting. The Silurian changed that. The ozone layer stabilized. Tiny plants crept up from the water's edge. Arthropods followed, breathing air for the first time. The world that emerged from the Silurian was unrecognizable from the world that entered it. Continents had collided. Fish had developed jaws. The architecture of marine ecosystems had been rebuilt, and life had established its first permanent foothold on land. 24 million years, barely a moment in Earth's history. Yet that moment changed everything. The Silurian was not dramatic, not an age of explosive evolutionary radiations. It was quieter, more subtle, but the work it accomplished laid foundations for everything that followed. You carry the Silurian within you, the jaw that shapes your words, the lungs that breathe the air, the vertebrate body plan that supports your every movement. All trace their ancestry to innovations that first appeared in fish navigating a recovering world. The Silurian asks nothing of us. It does not demand that we remember. The creatures that lived in those ancient seas had no conception of the future. They simply lived, generation after generation, doing what life has always done, persisting, adapting, filling every available niche. And in doing so, they gave us the world we inhabit today. The hour is late now. We have traveled through 24 million years of Earth's history. We have watched as reefs rose and fish developed jaws. We have seen the first plants colonize the land and the first arthropods follow them. The Silurian seas are quiet tonight. The waves roll in with the same patient rhythm they have kept for millions of years. Somewhere out in the darkness, a stromatoporoid reef is growing, one thin layer at a time. Crinoids sway in the gentle current. A trilobite settles into the sediment. On the shore, the first plants stand in silence. Among them, a millipede moves slowly through the damp litter. The land is quiet. The sea is quiet. The world breathes slowly in and out. You have traveled far tonight, through time and space, through the deep archives of a planet that has been keeping records for 4 billion years. Let them settle now, these ancient memories. Let them drift down like sediment through quiet water. The Silurian is patient. It has waited 400 million years to tell its story. The seas are warm and shallow. The reefs are growing. The first green shoots are reaching toward a protected sky. Somewhere in those ancient waters, your ancestors are swimming. They do not know you yet, but they are there, living their lives, and through them, through the unbroken chain that connects their world to yours, you are there too. The light is fading now. The Silurian sun is setting over seas that stretch to every horizon. The water turns from blue to gold to deepening purple. The same stars are appearing in a sky that looks almost like the sky you know. Rest now. The journey is complete. The Silurian passes into memory, into stone, into the long silence of deep time where all things eventually go. But what it built remains. What it gave us remains. The jaws and the lungs and the green living land. These are its gifts to you, carried forward through 400 million years of change. The waves are gentle, the water is warm, the world is at peace. Sleep well, child of the Silurian. Good night.